This is one of the Gospels in which there's actually physical pieces missing out of the text. And so it trails off at the end, right in the middle of a sentence. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Mary. Peter said to Mary, "Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than any other woman. Tell us the words of the Savior that you know, but which we haven't yet heard." Mary responded, "I will report to you as much as I remember that you don't know." And she began to speak these words to them. She said, "I saw the Lord in a vision, and I said to him, 'Lord, I saw you today in a vision.' He said to me, 'Congratulations to you for not wavering at seeing me. For where the mind is, there is the treasure.' I said to him, 'Lord, how does a person who sees a vision actually see it? With the soul or with the spirit?' The Savior answered, 'The visionary does not see with the soul or with the spirit, but with the mind which exists between these two. That is what sees the vision, and that is what..." A word inspired by God. So I'm going to share with you a story that I've told you before, but it perfectly illustrates metaphorically what I'm going to get into today, the topic I'm going to talk about today. And it was a story and experience I had about 1976-77. I was living in a little mission in Kenya at the time called Kipchimchim. And Kipchimchim was about 6 miles from a big town called Kericho. And Kericho was the center of the tea growing district of Kenya. And right in the center of Kericho was a big hotel, an old hotel called, appropriately enough, the Tea Hotel. It was a beautiful old building and a very big dining room in it. And one wall of the dining room was just completely windows. And so you had a great view out into the tea fields. There was a swimming pool nearby. And I'm up there one day with a friend of mine having lunch, and the dining room was pretty packed. And I'm sitting right next to the window looking out, and all of a sudden this gorgeous looking woman starts coming up. Now the outside of this window is silvered, so from the outside it looks like a mirror, but from inside you can look through it. So this woman comes up, notices herself in the reflection, and is really taken with her own appearance. So she kind of sidles up to it and kind of does her hair. So just looking at her, really pleased with what she's seeing, as was I, and everybody else. And so she's literally about 2 feet away, but she thinks she's just looking at a mirror and we're looking out at her. So having kind of frilled herself up, but she discovers she's got a booger in her nose. She goes, examines it I'm thinking for a minute, she's going to eat it. No, she flicks it, and it comes right at me, and I duck. And there it is, dangling off the window. Now the whole group inside have seen this performance, and there's just uproar. Everybody has gone hysterical with laughter. And she's totally unaware of it. So she comes right up the side, and comes in the front door, and the whole place is in hysterics. She comes in, and she, wow, happy crowd. This is my kind of place. I'm going to eat here. And sits down and eats, totally unaware what had happened. Now, that illustrates perfectly what I want to get into, because in a sense, there are 3 kinds of people. There are people on the outside looking, and all they can see is the outside, because the silver is on the outside. So they think reality consists of what's on this side of the mirror. So only the outside is real. So these are like kind of people who are into hedonism, people who think that this world is all there is, and the pleasures of this world are all that's important. Or it's kind of scientism, the kind of the version, the kind of the mockery of science that says nothing is real unless it's sensible. In other words, that we can sense it. So they're the people on the outside looking at the window, but only seeing the silver and thinking that only the outside is real. Now there's another group on the inside. Imagine that the inside of the window is silvered, and you're inside, you can't look out. All you can see is what's inside. So there isn't an outside as far as these people are concerned. And they represent kind of ultra-ascetics, people who think that the world is an illusion. There's nothing out there. It's an illusion that there's anything out there. There's just the inside, and we have to be really ascetical and new agey and pretend like there's nothing out there. There's a third position, and that's where there's silver neither on the inside nor on the outside. So when you're outside, you can see what's outside, and you can see what's inside. And when you're inside, you can see what's inside, and you can see what's outside. And this is mysticism. Mysticism is the ability to be at least bilingual, if not multilingual. So wherever you are, you can see everything else as well. And you're not under the delusion that all that is all that surrounds you. You can look in if you're outside, and look out if you're inside, and you can see both parts of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the Gospel of Mary. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about this very strange statement where Jesus says to her, it is not the soul that sees visions, and it's not the spirit that sees visions, it's the mind. So the second point, I'll talk about spirit, soul, and mind. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about reality checking. Then fourthly, I'm going to talk about this great passage that Ron read for us in the first reading, the pearl merchant. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the Gospel of Mary. The Gospel I read is the Gospel of Mary of Magdala. And this was a Gospel that was discovered in 1896. So let me give you a little kind of the context vis-a-vis the other great findings. The Nag Hammadi scrolls were not found until 1945, and the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't found until 1947. So the Gospel of Mary was found a long time before that. It was found in 1896 in a grave in Egypt. And it was bought by a German scholar called Karl Reinhardt. And he brought it back to Berlin, and it's still in the museum in Berlin. So that was 1896. But it never got published because of 2 world wars in Europe. It didn't get published until 1953. So the world wasn't really aware of it until 1953, until it got translated into German and many other languages. But the papyrus that was found in 1896 actually is a codex, and it's very easy to date these things because of paleography, the study of ancient writings. You know particularly when particular kinds of punctuation marks became prevalent, or particular kinds of scripts or fonts were used, so you can date it very accurately. So this particular text is from the 5th century. The actual physical parchment, papyrus, is from the 5th century. But it's actually much older. It's written in a language called Sahidic, which is an Egyptian language. But subsequently, after 1896, there were 2 more fragments of this gospel found written in Greek. And the scholars believe that the original was actually written in Greek. Now, there's a little bit of dispute about when it may have been written. There are some scholars, including a brilliant scholar in Harvard called Karen King. And Karen King believes that it dates right back to the time of Jesus himself, that it was actually written a year or 2 after Jesus died. Other scholars claim it was written maybe about 150 AD, but it's certainly really, really, really old. And it was written originally then in Greek and translated into many different languages. And the basic outline of the document is this. There are pieces missing, as you can see. The first 6 pages are missing, and there's a whole bunch of stuff missing in the middle. Pages 11 through 14 are missing, and then it picks up again. So today we were reading a passage that ended at page 11, so there's a gap in the text. So the first 6 pages are missing. So the gospel starts in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a scene. And then at page 11, there's a big gap. 11, 12, 13, 14 are missing, and then it picks up again. So it's a little bit difficult to follow the train of thought. But basically, the outline is the following. It's a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. So shortly after Jesus has died, he appears to a group of the disciples, including the apostles Peter and Andrew, his brother, and Levi, and Mary of Magdala. And there's a question and answer series going on between Jesus and the disciples. They're asking him particular questions, particularly around matter. What does it mean to have matter, physicality? And they're asking him about sin and resurrection. So it's a question and answer series. And then Jesus departs, and they're really filled with anxiety. They're thinking, what are we going to do now? He's gone. What are we going to do? And then Mary takes over, Mary of Magdala, and she begins to comfort them and to give them heart. And Peter asks her, he says, Mary, this is today's passage, we know that the Savior loved you more than he loved any other woman. So he must have told you things that he didn't tell anybody else. So can you share with us some of the stuff he told you that he didn't tell to anybody else? And she says, well. And then she begins telling him about particular visions and things that Jesus said to her. And it goes on beyond today, picks up, next Sunday. And at the end of her exposition, Andrew, who's Peter's brother, gets really, really upset with Mary. And he says, I don't believe any of these things. Am I really going to believe that Jesus told this stuff to you and he didn't tell it to us. This is, balderdash. I can't accept it. And Peter chimes in with his brother. He says, you're absolutely right. He's going to tell a woman these kinds of things and he didn't tell us? No bloody way. I can't believe this. So Mary starts crying. She's really upset. They asked her to tell them stuff that Jesus had revealed to her, that he hadn't to them. She tells them, and then they jump all over her. So Levi jumps into her defense. Levi is another name from Matthew. And Levi says to Peter, you've always been hot-headed. You're an angry kind of person. You're always putting your foot in it. I believe completely that Jesus told Mary these things because I know he was closer to her than he was to anybody else. So don't be so pig-headed. Listen to what she has to say. Now, in actual fact, in many of the Gnostic Gospels, there's a great rivalry between Mary of Magdala and Peter. Tremendous rivalry in many of the Gnostic Gospels. And it goes back to the fact that there are two issues going on here. Peter and Andrew represent, a stream of Christianity which is really orthodox and still very steeped in Judaism and in patriarchy and in kind of dogma and legalism. And so they find it very, very difficult to accept Mary's revelation, which is much more esoteric and much more mystical. So that's the first strike against her, that the revelations she's giving are really mystical and esoteric, and they want much more kind of dogmatic, grounded in kind of Judaism model. And the second thing is that she's merely a woman. Now at this stage of Christianity, although it started off very, very egalitarian, and many of the leaders of the early church were women, by the time the church tried to get respectability in the world of its time, it had to kind of abandon this equality and adopt a patriarchal mindset. Otherwise, they weren't credible and they weren't respectable. So they started pushing women out of positions of leadership and suppressing gospels which had been written by women. So that's what's been represented here today. It's this tug of war between a patriarchal system which is striving for orthodoxy and credibility and respectability on the one hand, and this esoteric mystical stream, often which is led by women. So that's the basis of Mary's gospel today. That's the background to the story. Just bring it to my second point. So Mary then reports this vision she had, that where she saw Jesus in a vision, and she said to him, Lord, today I saw you in a vision. And then she has a question for him. She says, when a visionary has a vision, is the vision mediated by the Spirit, or is it mediated by the soul? And Jesus makes a very strange answer. He says, a vision is not mediated by a spirit or by the soul, but by the mind. Now that's totally counterintuitive to us. Now the thing we need to understand is this. Our definitions of spirit and soul and mind are very different from those times. Much of the Gnostic material is very Platonic. There's a huge influence of Plato. In fact, the Nag Hammadi scrolls contained a lot of the works of Plato himself transcribed and translated into Coptic. So there was a huge cache of material found at Nag Hammadi, which is actually Plato's own writings translated into Coptic. So there's a very big Platonic influence on Gnostic spirituality. And Plato uses these words in a way that we don't tend to use them. We would think in our times that spirit means God, and soul means that bite-sized piece of God, which every one of us is at core, and mind is merely a human attribute. But that is not how Plato uses these. He definitely uses spirit as source, but the word soul in Greek is psyche. So when he's talking about soul, he's talking about the psyche. So in actual fact, the Greek word for a soul is psyche. And psyche for Plato represents that kind of discursive, cognitive, intellectual, rational side. So the soul for Plato represents discursive rationality. Whereas the word he uses for mind is the word nous. And nous represents an intuitive kind of knowing, a Gnostic awareness. So Gnosticism represents a knowing at a different level from merely intellectual, discursive, rational thinking. And so they're reversed. We think of them very, very differently. So in Plato's model, the spirit represents God, the soul just represents the human faculty of reason, whereas the mind represents that place in between reason and source. So it's the mediating, it is the corridor that connects mere reason with source. So it's a very intuitive kind of faculty. Now I remember when I was studying philosophy and logic at university, we were given this statement from Thomistic philosophy that said, Nihil est in intellectu quod non ante fuerit in sensu. There is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. So the belief system was that the only way we could garner knowledge was by soaking it into our sensorium and then operating on it cognitively, and that's how we achieve knowledge. Now that may be true of knowledge, but it is not true of wisdom. Wisdom is very different from knowledge. Knowledge are the factoids that can be delivered by our sensorium and by working on it with this little black box that we carry between our ears. That's knowledge. It gives us factoids and it gives us data, which are very important for operating in the physical world. But it cannot tell us about the metaphysical world. Metaphysics can only be delivered by some kind of an intuitive faculty. And Carl Jung actually described this. Carl Jung described intuition as perception via the unconscious. Not through the consciousness, not through the sensorium and rational thinking, but at a very, very different level. So that's what Jesus is saying to Mary today. In order to apprehend, in order to really have a visionary experience, you can't have it with your senses, and you can't have it with your soul. If by soul we mean rational faculties, that is not going to deliver vision to you, visions to you. Visions come when you operate at the intuitive level, when you're in mind, as it's discussed by Plato. That highly intuitive faculty, that is how visions come through to us. So that's what Jesus is trying to explain to Mary today. So it's not that somehow that our cognitive faculty stands in between soul, the bite-sized piece of God, and source. We're redefining the terms very, very differently. So we can only have visions, Jesus says, when we're prepared to operate at a trans-rational level. It's not irrational in the sense that it doesn't make sense. It is trans-rational. It includes what goes beyond mere cognitive, discursive thought. And that's how we make contact with the dimensions that lie beyond us. So that's the second point I want to make. Third point I call reality checking. So let me go back now again to the story of the Tea Hotel and to talk about the notion of illusion. And Ron mentioned this as well in the second reading, which was a discussion of resurrection. And I talked about, is resurrection an illusion? And again, we have these extraordinary ideas about illusion. We think often that when mystics say that the world is an illusion, that what they're saying is that the world doesn't exist. That is not what they're saying. The illusion is not that it doesn't exist. The illusion is that that is all that exists. They're not saying it's not real. What they're saying is, the illusion is that people think that and that alone constitutes reality. So you have to realize that there are two sides to this window, that you can look from the inside out or from the outside in. And even when you're inside, you see both the inside and the outside. The job of the mystic is to become multilingual, at least bilingual, but possibly even multilingual, having access to many different states of consciousness and drawing upon the faculties that allow us to experience the entities that reside in these different levels and the rules that apply. There are very different rules to the physical universe as they are to the metaphysical universe. You know this yourself, every single one of you. Every night when you dream, you enter a reality in which the laws of gravity do not necessarily apply. You can fly in your dreams. The laws of time don't apply. The laws of causation don't apply. Identity is very, very different in a dream from what it is in waking reality. In waking reality, we tend to identify with our physicality. In dream reality, we don't. The sense of self is very, very different. How many times have you said, I was at home in my dream, but it didn't look like my house? Or I met my mother, but she didn't actually look like my mother? So the sense of who's who is very different in a dream. So identity changes, physical laws change, time changes, causation changes, and the mystic is the person who can access these different realms and engage with and encounter these different kinds of people. So the illusion is not that the world is not real and doesn't exist. The illusion is to think that only the physical reality is true. That is the illusion. And so, for instance, we think about the kingdom of heaven. When I was teaching in Kenya and using Swahili to my audience, I would pun on this. I would say in Swahili, Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. So it's an alliterative pun in Swahili. Mbinguni si mahali, bali ni hali. The kingdom of heaven is not a place, it's a state of mind. It literally is about shifting dimensions. So the kingdom of heaven is never about, look, there it is over there, or it's right here. Christ says, Don't believe it. People say it's there or there. The kingdom of heaven is en massoi. The kingdom of heaven is among you, and the kingdom of heaven is within you. It's a shift in consciousness that gives us access to the kingdom of heaven. A great Indian saint, a guy called Kabir, who lived in the 1500s. He was born to a Hindu family, orphaned very, very early on, adopted by Muslim adoptive parents, became a Muslim, and became a Christian, and became a Hindu. He practiced all three faiths. He was a deep, deep, deep mystic. So he was interested in the great teachings of all these systems. And he said very powerfully one time, he said, Jesus, blessed be he, said one time, life is a bridge. Walk upon it, but do not build your house upon it. So that's really what this reality checking is about. That is really what it means to break through this level of reality. It's to understand that life is a bridge. It's real. Bridges are real. We need them to cross over, but we don't build our houses there. So the trick is to honor incarnation fully. We have to honor our bodies, honor our emotions, honor our intellect, honor our physical needs. And we need to honor the physical needs and the bodies of other human beings. And we need to honor the physical body and the needs of our mother, Gaia, the planet itself. So we need to honor all those, but they're not our ultimate home. We're here on safari. We're here on a mission. So the illusion becomes that we think that this is all there is. Or the illusion becomes that we think that this isn't real, that it's only made up. It is really real. It's very important. It needs to be honored, but we can't identify with it. And this was the great job of the Buddha and the job of Jesus. So Buddha tried both perspectives before he found the right one. He stood on the outside looking at the mirror and thinking only the outside was real. He was a hedonist, a total committed hedonist for the first 29 years of his life. He was born into a very, very rich family, and he was totally pampered for the first 29 years of his life. So he's standing outside the window, looking at what appears to be a mirror, and believing only on the outside. And then for the next 6 years, he becomes the ultimate ascetic, finally subsisting on a single grain of rice a day. So now he's on the inside, looking this way, and all he sees is the mirror that reflects the interior. And he thinks by becoming more and more ascetical, he's going to find truth. And after 6 years of that, he realizes the truth isn't from the outside or the inside, it's both. And he finally gets it, and he called it the middle way. The realization that our experience is true, but that we have to have the ability to transcend different levels of reality. And Jesus would come to the same conclusion. Jesus stands, Jesus is like stage 3 of the Buddha. Herod is like stage 1 of the Buddha, and John the Baptist is like stage 2 of the Buddha. So Herod was the ultimate, in hedonism, just totally, satiated with sensuality. John the Baptist was the ultimate ascetic in the pre-Christian era. And Christ is in between the two of them. So Christ would be accused of being a drunkard and a glutton and hanging out with prostitutes and sinners, because Christ was the middle way. The realization that both parts are real, and that it is salvation by association, not salvation by separation. So both the Buddha and Jesus will get to the very, very same place, that there's a middle way between those who can only look from the outside and think only the outside exists, and those who can look only from the inside and think only the inside exists, to a position where they see that both are levels of reality. That's my third point. And the fourth point, and I want to take this beautiful story that Ron read for us, the pearl merchant. Now, you've heard the story being read. There are many, many, many ways in which we happen upon or fall into the kingdom of heaven. And Christ illustrates this very beautifully in a whole bunch of his parables. So one metaphor he uses is some people happen upon the kingdom of heaven like farmers do. So he says a farmer goes out and he sows his seed in the ground, and then he goes home and he goes to sleep. And he doesn't bother about it. For months and months and months he doesn't bother about it. And of its own accord, the seed begins to grow, and it sprouts, and it creates a stalk, and it creates a head, and it creates corn. And then the farmer goes out and he harvests it. So all he did was he set the intention. He sowed the seed. For some people, Christ says, that's how they happen upon the kingdom of heaven. They just sow the seed. I have an intention about finding God, and I just sow the seed, and then I go about my business. And it just happens of its own accord. So that's the farmer metaphor. Other people find it by being fishermen. So the fisherman is the guy who goes out day by day, and he throws his net into the sea, and he hauls in all kinds of stuff. Old bicycle tires, mudfish and flatfish and all kinds of stuff. And he sorts it out, and he takes what's useful, and he throws the rest away. So these are the people who are actually, they're seekers. They're constantly working at the kingdom of heaven. They're constantly seeking enlightenment or spirituality, and they're able to sort among the ideas they find. Some ideas are really crazy, and they discard them. Some of them really feed them, and they take those in. So Christ says that's another group. That's how they find the kingdom of heaven. And then there's the story about a day laborer. There's a person who finds the kingdom like a day laborer. This is a man who didn't have property of his own. He's working for a farmer, and he's digging in the field one day, and he discovers buried treasure. But he can't own it because the field is not his. So he covers it back up, and he goes back to the farmer and he says, you know what? I'd like to buy a piece of property, so I'm wondering if you'd sell me the field. And the farmer said, sure, if you can afford it. So the guy goes home and sells everything he has and comes back and buys the field. And now that he owns the field, he owns the treasure buried in the field, and he digs up the treasure and now becomes a very rich man. So this is a third way of happening upon the kingdom of heaven. You're minding your own business. You have no interest whatsoever in the kingdom. All of a sudden, you discover it, but you know that now you have to sell everything you possess in order to own the kingdom. So everything subsequently is at the service of the kingdom. So Christ says that's the third way in which people find the kingdom. And then there's the fourth way. There's the pearl merchant that Ron talked about today. And this is a guy who spent his entire lifetime looking for this special pearl. And he's traveling through all of the bazaars of the Middle East looking for this great, great, great pearl. And one day, in a small little dukkha in the back streets of Jerusalem, he finds it in a poky little place. He spots it. He says, my God, that's it. That's what I've been looking for all my life. And he says to the guy, put that aside for one day. Please, just one day. I'll be back and I'll buy it. And he goes out and he sells all the other stuff he has. He goes back and he sells his house and he gets all the money together and he comes back and he buys that pearl. You know, that's like somebody who spent their lifetime looking for the kingdom of heaven, trying to find enlightenment, and then they discover what it's about. But again, they have to sell everything. Everything they now own has to be at the disposal of and the service of the mission and of the kingdom itself. So Christ says there are many, many ways in which we stumble upon or happen upon the kingdom. It doesn't particularly matter which way it happens, but the result is always the same. No matter how you find it, whether it's the farmer, the fisherman, the day laborer, or the pearl merchant, when you find it, you have to sell everything in order to be at the service of this. Now, this is the story that's picked up today. So in this great story, it's obviously after the death of Jesus. The disciples are kind of wondering, what are we going to do now? So they get on board a ship, and they're sailing out into, obviously, the Mediterranean, and they come across a city in the middle of the sea. And they try to disembark, and they're looking for lodgings for the night, and they see this very, very handsome figure on the dock. And Peter says to him, my brother, my friend, can you help us to get lodging? And the guy says to them, thank you for calling me your brother and your friend, because I am. So they still don't recognize that it's Jesus. And he says, but unfortunately, I don't live here either. I'm a stranger like you. And then he turns around and he says, pearls, pearls. And everybody starts looking out their windows. It's a pearl merchant guy selling pearls. And they look out, and then they realize he doesn't have a backpack on, and he doesn't have a carrier. So how could he be selling stuff? He says, this is mishigas. But the poor people hear him, and they come running out, and they say to him, sir, we're the poor people. We can't afford to buy pearls, but you know what? I'd love to be able to say to my neighbor, I saw a pearl. Could you just show me a pearl? And the figure says to him, as Christ of it, he says, I'll give you a better deal than that. If you come to visit me in my city, not only will I show you the pearl, I'll give it to you for nothing. It's yours. Now at this stage, Peter recognizes that it's Jesus. Now this notion of this pearl merchant is actually much, much, much older than Christianity. In many different traditions, there are stories about a king, and sometimes he's a king in an exotic country, and sometimes he's a king in another planet who has two children, a boy and a girl. And he sends them from home into a different country or to a different planet in order to have an experience of what it's like to live in a totally different kind of a civilization. But they come down and they disguise themselves. In order to fit into this planet or to fit into the new country, they disguise themselves, their dress and their eating habits and their culture so as to fit in. But slowly by slowly, they get seduced and they forget where they've come from, who they are, and what the purpose was. And now they believe that they belong to this new culture. And the father freaks out. And the father picks one of his wisest counselors and he says, I want you to go down to that planet or to that country, and I want you to dissolve the illusion, that's enshrouded my children. Let them remember who they are. And the wise one comes down and he finds the two kids, and slowly by slowly he helps to dissolve the illusion and the amnesia, and they finally remember and they wake up to who they really are. Now that's the background to this story today. This was the particular Christian version of this ancient story. So what does it represent? Obviously, the pearl represents the divine essence inside in each one of us. But only the poor people recognize that. The rich merchants are totally focused on the external physical world. So they're at the outside and they don't believe there is an inside. So once they find out that this guy doesn't have physical pearls, they have no interest in him anymore. So they're totally focused on the outside. The poor represent those people, who are looking for some kind of opportunity to kind of create happiness for themselves. So they're open to new possibilities. And the Jesus figure, obviously, is the avatar figure. So in some senses, the pearl is the essence, the God essence within each one of us. But incarnation is the journey to a new planet or to a different country. And unfortunately, when we come here, we come in disguise. We put on the clothes of this planet, and we adopt the cultures of this planet. We put on this particular kind of a spacesuit, and very, very quickly, we forget. We forget where we've come from, we forget who we are, and we forget the purpose of our coming. And so God has to send these wise ones, these avatars, to come down to wake us up occasionally so that we remember exactly who we are. And that's putting us in contact with the pearl inside in each one of us. And that's the great insight of the Mary of Magdala's of the world. Mary was the one who could see the essence of Christ and therefore see her own essence. So Mary had a level of teaching that the other disciples couldn't understand, and they got upset with her for that. But it's the situation in which each one of us finds ourselves. Locked within every single one of us is this pearl of great price, but has been occluded and obfuscated by our spacesuits, by the cultures in which we live and in which we've grown up, and most of us have amnesia. And every so often, we either happen upon it, like the day laborer, or we set out in search of it, and we finally find it, or we're like the farmer who just has an intention, or the fisherman who's making some kind of an effort. But whatever happens, once you get a glimpse of the pearl, you realize it costs not less than everything.